See. I'm going to stop recording. Hold on.
To get us going? Yes. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Alexa Trolley Hansen, and I'm a doctoral student at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University and the moderator for today's Making Sense of Employment Research webinar. Thank you all for your patience. We are excited to get started. This webinar is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. The webinar content does not represent the views or policies of the funding agency, and you should not assume endorsement of the funding agency. The territory on which Boston University stands is that of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people, and we honor and respect the history and current efforts of Native Indigenous communities. This webinar is being recorded so that you can access it later. Also, closed captioning has been turned on, and you can access this by clicking the bottom of your screen. In case this is your first webinar with us, I'm going to introduce our speaker who will share their research with you, and then we will have a question and answer session at the end. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, and I will pose them in order at the end. If you have a technical question, please reach out to me directly using the chat feature. Also, we would really appreciate your feedback at the end of this webinar, so I'll be posting a survey in the chat. I would like to welcome Dr. Marta Elliott, who is going to present her work on benefits and challenges of employment for individuals diagnosed with mental illness, qualitative findings, and ongoing research. Dr. Elliott is a Foundation Professor of Sociology at the University of Nevada, Reno, who graduated with a PhD in sociology from Johns Hopkins University in 1995. She specializes in studying social determinants of mental health, the causes and consequences of mental illness stigma, and the subjective perspectives of people diagnosed with mental illness. She is writing a book entitled Borderpolars that features perspectives of people diagnosed with and bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. Dr. Elliott, welcome, and we are excited to hear from you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm excited to talk about this research. I'm going to go right ahead and introduce my co-author who is attending this webinar, Jordan Reuter. Reuter is a PhD candidate here in social psychology. He has a Belinsky Fellowship. He's graduating this year, going on the job market, and he was very essential to this study and other studies we've published with these data. It's just basically my right-hand man interpreting the data and helping write the articles. So I want to acknowledge his contribution. And there's a link to his email there if you ever want to get in touch with him. This is the front page and abstract of the article, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about today. And let's see. There we go. So you should be able to find this through your library system, depending on where you are. But if you can't, you can email me for it. I go right along. Well, let me just take a moment here to talk about why I use the term mental illness and not psychiatric disorder. I say diagnosed with mental illness. I want to acknowledge that people have different comfort levels with different terms. And my own term, mental illness, works for me because I had a serious mental illness when I was 21. And this is the term that I've always felt comfortable with personally. And part of the reason is, you always use it. But a second reason is that I have some qualms with the psychiatric diagnostic system, and I don't like to apply diagnoses to myself. I more interrogate them, but I completely respect people who do identify with diagnoses, and I'm interested in their point of view. So that's my choice of terminology. Okay, so I just want to give a little background on this subject before we launch into sharing our results. So the first point is, overall, we know from decades of research that people who are employed tend to have overall better mental health than people who are not employed, but that's a huge generalization. So when you look at jobs, there are certain job conditions that predict better mental health among people who are employed, such as being paid fairly, having job security, having some control over job conditions, working with people who are supportive, mutually supportive, and having a sense that you matter to the workplace. All of these things predict better mental health, whereas some of the other working conditions that tend to predict worse mental health are having to work very long hours, having high pressure, and some unpredictability. Also, stigma, either public or internalized, predicts worse mental health. And by this, I mean, if you experience prejudice and discrimination in the workplace as a person diagnosed with a mental illness, it may worsen your mental health. That is, it has its own sort of predictive power over and above any symptoms you might already have. And better mental health, when I say that, what I mean is fewer negative symptoms, higher self-esteem, better quality of life, greater sense of purpose. These are the studies that I'm drawing on, and this is what they mean by better mental health when I give you these findings. And then when I say worse mental health, the research that I'm drawing from tends to measure that with symptoms of depression and anxiety. Okay, let's look at a few of the effects of mental health on employment. So most of the research focuses on negative effects. So that's something that we have tried to turn around with this study. So for example, the studies that we reviewed show that having a diagnosis like bipolar or depression predicts lack of productivity, absenteeism, and so on, really focusing on the negatives. And it's not that these negatives don't exist, but there's a larger story to tell. Having lived experience, however, having an experience, being diagnosed with mental illness, experiencing mental illness, tends to predict greater empathy towards other people going through similar experiences, and just towards people in general. People with bipolar disorder, diagnosed with bipolar disorder specifically, we may excel in jobs that demand complex tasks and creativity. I'm drawing on research again there. All right, so let's move on to our data. So I interviewed 56 people. Some of the interviews were in person, some of them were virtual like this, and even over the phone. So I recruited people with this exact wording: working professionals diagnosed with a mental illness. You notice I don't say serious. I don't define working professional. I don't define mental illness. This was open to the interpretation of people who saw this flyer all over social media and so on. And the interviews were a while ago, before the pandemic. The age of people ranged from 31 to 58. As you can imagine, it takes a little while to get established as a working professional, especially if you've been diagnosed with mental illness. The majority were women, and the remainder were men. There were a couple people who were transgender in there, but I go with their own gender identity. Most people were married or living with a partner, or in a relationship, although 1 in 4 were single. Okay, going on. It's a pretty white sample. It was difficult to get a diverse sample in the race and ethnicity, although I did interview 4 people who identified as Asian American, 2 who identified as Black or African American, and 1 who was Brazilian. Everyone else was white. So the professions were very diverse. I can't really talk about specific professions except for one, because there weren't enough people in each category, but there were business executives, college professors, computer programmers, IT specialists, engineers, lawyers, doctors, researchers, mental health professionals or therapists. That's the one category where we did publish a paper about them, and writers and various other professions. Most people just reported 1 diagnosis, but 1 in 4 reported 2, which is not unusual at all. A few people reported 3 or even 4. And lastly, the most common diagnoses were anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder, and depression. Okay, so we're going to focus on the 4 questions that we asked and reported on. How did having a mental illness pose challenges on the job? So that's a reframing of the negative portrayal we see of it. How did the job challenges make symptoms worse? So how did the job itself affect one's symptoms? How did employment benefit mental health? You know, we talked earlier about the benefits. And then how did having a mental illness improve job performance? And that's really a turn on the sort of negativity bias in the literature that assumes that having a mental illness worsens job performance. Okay, I have a little poll here. So let's run the first poll. So which of the four do you think was most often reported? So take a moment. The mental illness posing challenges, the job making mental illness worse, the job improving mental health, or the mental illness improving the job performance? What do you think was reported the most often? Like we've almost got everybody. Oh no, there's 44 people now. Somebody raised their hand. Was there a question? Are we taking questions? Might not be able to read this.
No, just a reminder, if you have a question, please type it into the question and answer box at the bottom, and we will answer all the questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, looks like we're about done. See how. Let's share the results. Everyone see the results? Okay, so most common answer was, how did job challenges make symptoms worse? Okay, let's go ahead and go on to the actual answer. So you can take that down. All right. Or I will. Okay. You were right. How did job challenges make symptoms worse? All right, let's go ahead and look at each of these in turn. So we'll start with challenges posed by having a psychiatric disorder or mental illness for employment. So we found some themes here. One was, well, having symptoms led to poor work performance. Also, we found that having a mental illness led to problematic behaviors on the job. So we have another quick poll here to see which one of those two do you think was mentioned most frequently by the 56 people who took the survey. Kind of like popping popcorn, you're like listening for the last pops. Right, okay. I think we're done. Okay, so poor work performance, it was the most common answer among you. And let's go ahead and see what the correct answer was. You were right again. All right. Very good. Did you read the paper already, everybody? Just super smart. Okay. So some of the things about poor work performance that people mentioned. Low productivity owing to lack of motivation. Need to take a leave of absence owing to inability to function at work. So I'm going to give you some examples of people who said that with actual direct quotes from them. So of course, these names are pseudonyms. We're not identifying the people who we interviewed. Teresa was a social worker diagnosed with depression and experiencing depression. So she was okay when I interviewed her, but in the past, she said, I was not able to focus. There were times I was coming in late. I would randomly start crying. I was not able to complete a documentation on time because I would sit and stare at the computer, and then it would be an hour later and I had typed 2 words. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that feeling of just not being able to move or do anything, even when you're at work. Another person was, we're calling Liam, a professor who had bipolar disorder, and I just loved his vivid descriptions of his experience. For example, he said, For whatever reason, if I have to do something, I can force myself to do it. So I've given lectures in a depressive state. They've been horrendous lectures, but I've given them. It's simply park the car in the garage, walk to the lecture hall. Of course, he delivers the lecture, walk back to my car, get in the car, back into bed, sort of thing. So, I could relate to that too. It's incredible what we can get ourselves to do even in a really bad state. And then here's some examples of needing to take a leave of absence or take time off. So Amy, a different social worker who had obsessive compulsive disorder, just said, I could not be there for other people. And of course she wanted to be, that was her job, that was her vocation, but there were times she could not be, so she didn't work. Gregory is a psychiatrist and a researcher with borderpolar disorder who is not public about his condition, so that's definitely a pseudonym. But he talked about a time when I remember basically completely putting my work down and resting. Then I got a really good score on a grant. So he was writing a NIH or NSF grant. Some of you know how hard that is. And someone he worked with just said, why don't you take a little time off? And it really helped him. And then he came back and did a fabulous job. So just goes to show a little time off can help. Now, Thomas, a trial attorney who was diagnosed with bipolar, gave an example of problematic behaviors on the job. And this is just really poignant to me. So he's describing a moment where he's arguing in court. I was just being very angry with her, the person on the witness stand, and inappropriately angry. I was, being aggressive in a way which, as a lawyer, I don't think I would have wanted to be, but, makes me very sad. And he's sad because he feels responsible, but also because after that, he was sort of taken out of the courtroom and given a more of a desk job. He didn't control his temper. He couldn't control his temper that day. Jack is an engineer who was formerly a film director, also diagnosed with bipolar, and loved film directing, but it just really interfered with, and it being a film director and working in, I think, Hollywood, really aggravated his moods. So he switched to engineering, which worked better for him. He would say, I went around freaking out, my emotions volcano out. Why was I getting so mad? That was in the past. Okay. Now we're going to go on to the next theme, challenges posed by one's job that make symptoms worse. So we're going to have another poll here to see which one of these two you think was reported most often. Slowing down, share the results. Okay, so the most popular answer here was interpersonal stressors on the job, not stressful job requirements. I think you got this one wrong. I'm sorry. 1 second. Oops. Okay, let's get to the correct answer. It was stressful job requirements. That's what I thought. Okay. So let's look at some examples of stressful job requirements. Heather was a research project manager diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and dysthymia. If you're not familiar with that, it's more of a low grade, but fairly constant depression. She says, describing her workplace, we were understaffed, poorly staffed, and everything was falling on me. I was taking everything on, working 12-hour days. And of course, that's not good for anyone's health, and it was hard for her. Another one is Lewis, who is an investment banker, who also, he switched careers to be more consonant with his bipolar disorder. But when he was working as an investment banker, he said, the job was very intense, around the clock, unpredictable, lots of travel. Then getting to a new place, the client would want to go out for drinks. People working on the deal would want to go out a lot. And this really disrupted his sleep, and all of the alcohol was hard on him. So that just didn't work out. And let me pause for a minute and just point out that interviewing working professionals is certainly not representative of all people who work who have mental illness. And I've done studies in the past where I drew on more of a broad spectrum, socioeconomic spectrum, but I wanted to do this study partly just to show that there are so many people, including myself, in really high profile positions who may have a diagnosis or be dealing with poor mental health. And that was part of the point of this. Not to, of course, disregard everyone else. Okay, examples of interpersonal strain. Rebecca was a university professor I interviewed who was diagnosed with depression. And she described a different campus she was on before she moved around to get to a healthier place. But campus where she was one big dysfunctional family who began a campaign to get rid of me, saying things behind my back, starting rumors, sabotaging me. And this happened when she had to take a leave, an FMLA leave for a while, to deal with being suicidal. And when she came back, she realized that, at least she felt that this had happened, and she got a better job. Elizabeth was a fundraiser in philanthropy for a hospital, and she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She said, it was so stressful, I had to get hypnotherapy so I could breathe. It was one of those nightmare office situations where people are crying, people are swearing. It was actually before she worked at the hospital. But yeah, that's a stressor that I know I couldn't work in that kind of environment for very long. All right, let's move on to the benefits of being employed for mental health. So people mentioned social connections on the job, a sense of being accountable to others, learning job skills that are actually applicable to one's own mental health, and work being a refuge, like an escape from having a mental illness. So we're going to do a poll here to see which one of these four do you all think was reported most often. Okay, let's see the results. Here you go. So people said social connections was the most frequent answer, which is really interesting. Okay, let's go ahead and see what the correct answer was. You were right. Good job. Resonates. Okay, let's look at some examples of social connections. So Carrie was an IT worker, also diagnosed with bipolar. A lot of people, working professionals with mental illness, have this diagnosis you're starting to see. And what she pointed out is, even before I knew that I had this mental illness, I've always felt different from other people. But when I'm with my group of coworkers, I do feel like I belong, which was really cool. And when she said that, because she did have a sort of a sense of alienation in society, but being around IT people, it was just her, those were her people. Here's an example of feeling accountable. Barbara was a psychotherapist full-time. She dealt with depression, ADHD, capitalized, and an eating disorder. So she said, work definitely holds me accountable. It has been highly motivating to take care of myself. And you certainly see this with a lot of people who are in the helping professions, helping other people diagnosed with mental illness, that in part it helps them. But sometimes, like another person we saw, they have to take time off. They just take care of other people. Applicable job skills. So here we have Robert, a professional comedian and storyteller. You can imagine how interesting it was to interview him. He had pretty serious depression and suicidal ideation and even attempted suicide. So he said, I don't get through anything until I can tell the story, because writing the story helps me figure out where I am. It helps me figure out the why, and it gives me control over the events in the past. And it's important to point out that he did a lot of autobiographical comedy, right? So he would make a comedic presentation of his suicide attempt, and it was really therapeutic for him. So telling the story helped his mental health. Work as a refuge. So Jacob, it's kind of phenomenal that I interviewed somebody who was a director of an entire VA hospital and who had PTSD related to military combat, but was not public about that in the director role. See a lot of this where people are not comfortable sharing their diagnosis publicly, even if they work in a mental health setting. So he said, having a job like mine, I stay busy and focused on something outside of my mind. So he was focused on helping other people with PTSD, and it gave him a break. And then the last theme we're going to explore is the benefits of having a psychiatric disorder for one's job performance. And as you all know, this wasn't one of the most common themes overall, but people mentioned it. One was that it informs my work performance, and another one was that it makes me more productive. So this is our last audience poll. Let's go ahead and do that. Poll number 5. So which one do you think was reported most frequently? Productivity or work performance? Close to a tie here. There's a hint. Remember, there's a lot of people with diagnosed with bipolar disorder that they hint. Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and share the results. So people picked improved work performance. Let's go ahead and see what the correct answer was. I don't think I gave my hint early enough. It was productivity. And when we go look at the examples, we'll see not everyone has bipolar, but some did. So Danielle, a clinical psychologist. This is not productivity. This is work performance. Okay, a clinical psychologist with history of depression, ADHD, and anxiety. She said, to have lived the experience can afford you some insight and maybe some extra empathy. Then Zoe was a fiction writer with bipolar disorder. And this is really interesting. And you certainly heard about all of the famous poets and artists and so on. She said about her ability to write fiction, I see the world in a different way and pay attention to things that other people don't notice. So she felt that her ability to write, she was drawing on her experiences of mania and depression that allowed her to see the world differently than other people, made her a better writer. Okay, but the increased productivity was slightly more common, and Shirley, an actress and educator with bipolar, what she mentioned is that she actually misses the days when she could sleep. I miss the days, for instance, I could sleep for 4 hours a night for a month straight and program an entire video game in 1 month. So she's actually complaining a little bit about her medications, that she's not as productive as she used to be, although she still prefers to be on the medications. And I think that's the same for the next person, who is Aiden, a university professor and researcher. And he said, he was most productive when I'm starting to go into a manic episode, but once I'm in one, I'm doing a lot, but nothing useful. So he got something out of that slow rise into full-blown mania, but then he preferred to take medications to prevent these manic episodes because they got pretty bad. All right, one other thing I want to mention is that some people talked about a combination of positive and negative effects, and I want to point out a couple examples of those. So this is Elizabeth. She said that the interpersonal stressors on the job made her mental health worse. But as she got better, the social connections on the job made her mental health better. So it's not just a static thing. People's lives, change. And so she was talking about her trajectory. Rochelle said that job stressors like being understaffed and having too much responsibility led to a breakdown, but then she moved to a different job in a healthcare setting and took advantages of opportunities to develop skills and improve her mental health. So people in professional settings, at least, have this ability to move into different professions. One person even moved down the status ladder to have less stress, to be able to be happier. So what are the implications? Let's look at the first one we're suggesting, which is that future research should dive in and look at specific professions, mental health professionals, lawyers, physicians, professors, because the job conditions are somewhat tied to the type of job people have. And I would have liked to interview more people in each category if I had all the time in the world. Also, an important implication is that people with mental health conditions do excel in professional positions and should be supported by managers. I was really excited. I will just mention something about my own university. We met a person over in HR who handles requests for disability accommodations. And so I raised my hand feeling as if I was going to be coming up against a solid wall and asked, well, what about people with psychiatric diagnoses who come for accommodations? Because we know from the research that they're the least likely to receive accommodations. Also, they are afraid to even ask for them. And she said, well, I have bipolar disorder, so I'm very passionate about this. And I go out of my way. And please encourage anyone in that position to come to me, which was very unexpected. I was thrilled. Another implication, employers should ensure that working conditions promote employee well-being and deter unnecessary stressors. Now, we know employers pay lip service to this, but not a lot of employers actually enact it in obvious ways, in my opinion. Certainly not here. Employers should also follow evidence-based anti-stigma campaigns to promote acceptance of people diagnosed with mental illness and deter discrimination towards them. I also think people should just use common sense and be humane and kind to each other, and that will have some of the same effects. So I just wanted to point out some other papers that we published. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but they all draw on this same data set. And you can see a couple of them are with Jordan. One on religion, one on disclosure and identity. And I also mentioned that we've done a paper, this is with James Ragsdale, just on the people who were mental health professionals. There were 12 of them, really interesting themes. The last thing I'm going to tell you about is a new project that I'm doing, and it's a vignette embedded in a survey. So the vignette varies the gender of the person, either Michelle or Michael, woman or man, is either a data entry clerk or a lawyer. So we're manipulating the occupational status to see if it produces a bias in how people respond to Michelle or Michael. We're varying gender to see if that affects how people respond. And then in this case, if they're a lawyer, well, they both work in a law firm, so we're holding constant where they work. She or he recently met with their supervisor to ask for a flexible work arrangement. This is all constant, what's in blue. And then they would come into the office 2 days a week and work remotely 3 days a week. Now, people are more and more wanting to work remotely. Now, in one case, Michelle or Michael discloses that they've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And in the other case, they don't mention anything about mental health. But they always say this hybrid schedule would help perform better on the job because I would work in a quieter environment, free from office distractions. So what we're trying to find out here, we're manipulating all those things, is if being in a low status occupation, mentioning bipolar, or being female would increase sort of stereotypes that we're measuring. Like this person is just self-interested, they don't really care about their job. This person's work performance will suffer. And then the outcome is, do you think their request is reasonable or unreasonable? Do you think the supervisor should deny or support it? So the data are still being collected. we're going to have 1,600 responses from a national probability sample. So we'll hopefully get some interesting findings and publish them. So that is the end of my presentation. I've got both of our email addresses now here instead of just hyperlinks. So if you want to contact either of us, you can write those down.
Thank you, Dr. Elliott, for sharing your work with us. Now we'd like to move into the question and answer section of the webinar. There are some questions that have been posted and we're going to start with them first, but if you have additional questions, please post them in the Q&A box. I've also posted a survey about this webinar. It's really helpful to us as we head into this question and answer section, and as we start to think about ending, please complete the survey. But starting with our first question, there is a question. It seems like do you have citations for the article published about mental health professionals with mental illness? It looked like that was on that slide earlier, right?
Yeah, I think it's the third slide that shows the entire abstract.
Okay. And just to let you all know that this presentation, it has been recorded and will be available on our website within a couple of weeks so that you can go back and get that. And then one of the questions I have had is, can you share the slides if people reach out to you? Would you be willing to do that?
Oh, certainly, no problem.
So the best way for people to do that would be to email you, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. The next question would be, what does the job outlook for those with SMI and no college degree? How does this make entry into the job? How does one make entry into the job market?
The implications of this study, or just what do I think about having a serious mental illness, and what was the other thing? No.
And how does one make entry into the job market? I don't know if that was covered specifically in this study. I think it's more of a general question.
Yeah, well, I mean, for some people, such as someone in my family, they qualify for vocational rehab or actually get assistance finding a job with supports in place. So that's one thing to explore. Because then people in the know can support the person looking for a job to find a job that's already eager to hire people. They're going to say with disabilities. Sometimes that's a barrier to people. They don't like to identify as disabled, but it is the term that gets a person to be able to access those kind of services.
Right, thank you. There are a couple of questions in this next question, so I'll just kind of take them one at a time. Did any of the participants in this study have supports in obtaining or maintaining their employment?
Such as this, what I was just talking about. You know, that issue is covered in one of those other papers on the slides, but most people did not want to ask for supports. As I mentioned earlier, there were just a handful, I can't say the exact number, who did go and seek supports through their disability resource center, whatever it would be called, where they worked. And they had some pretty bad things to say about their experiences, which are covered in that other paper, but they didn't feel warmly received or supported. And that's why I had that attitude towards the person here at the University of Nevada, Reno, who turned out to be just the opposite.
Yeah, and I think this person goes on to say that they asked this question because their focus has been on individual placement and support for supported employment and education, and that they work with many students at post-secondary settings and support them in their professional employment. And so this person's kind of looking to see who else has participated or if anybody in that study had, which it sounds like it was hard to know, right?
Well, it wasn't one of my questions in the interview guide, but enough people brought it up that we did publish another paper in the Oxford handbook on the sociology of disability, I think, which is listed in there. Again, that you should be able to find that in the library.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is about your approach a little bit in your future research around profession-specific positions. And this person says, there are tests for personality attributes. Have you considered these rather than believing that a particular profession may be more or less stressful than another? People moving to perceived less stressful professions may find that due to their personality characteristics, they remained stressed.
Yeah, that's an interesting and probably true that, you know, there's that phrase, wherever you go, there you are. And I think that kind of applies here, that if we have like strong personality characteristics, we may find that any kind of job setting is going to pose some problem. So it's not like you can find the perfect job. It's more, can you get support and can you learn to live with yourself in a job setting that's best suited for however your personality is.
The tendency to not disclose mental health in the workplace for professionals really speaks to the powerful negative impacts of stigma. Does your work delve into this factor?
Yes, I have done quite a few studies on stigma, and I'm continuing to do them. So again, I'm going to do that one article from these data where we did address stigma head on. But some of my other work, like the experiment I mentioned at the end, and some other experimental research, manipulates characteristics of the person described to see if they increase or reduce perceived stigma. For example, you look at how people explain the causes of a psychiatric disorder, and if we tell them it was genetic, for instance, the general population tends to react negatively to that, which is interesting. It's the opposite of what we used to think when we did the campaign that it's a brain disorder, you know, you're born with it, it's not your fault. Well, in fact, the general public desires more social distance when they think that somebody has a genetic condition than when we say this person was in a tragic car accident and lost their best friend. Then they're like more sympathetic. That's one of the things we found.
Interesting. What strategies would you suggest that may support staff and faculty related to mental health? Do you have strategies to normalize healthy disclosure around one's mental health while mitigating stigma around mental health?
Well, I mean, I deal with a lot of students over my whole career here who disclose to me. And one thing I do is kind of caution them to not necessarily right away disclose to everyone, like I did today. You know, I'm a recorded webinar, it's out there, it's fine. Took me a long time to develop the confidence to be able to say things like that publicly. So I encourage people to take their time and feel out who is most supportive. This is another thing that we found from these interviews was that people did find some other supportive individuals at work, but they tended not to be open with everyone. They just found those people that they could talk to. So you have to be very discerning. I'm afraid I don't think we live in a culture where we can just tell everyone and not expect some, I can't think of the word, but negative reactions and even directed at us that we have to deal with.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. Did any of the individuals interviewed share about support that they received while going to college?
Again, we didn't really focus on college much. I did get some stories from college, experiences people had, because often in college, they were like peaking, for example, with just realizing they were having mania or substance abuse problems or depression and so on. But people didn't share or volunteer much about using their disability resource centers. That is something I'm really interested in a university environment anyway. And it's become a much bigger issue because of the pandemic and the increase in student mental health problems and a lot more students coming for accommodations. And so it's become an issue, I would say, in that some of the accommodations that were offered in the past were actually counterproductive to student success. So we've kind of been exploring that, trying to figure out what kind of accommodations will actually help students get through college, as opposed to, like, for example, extensions with no deadline were something that the DRC used to support, until we realized that that was too open-ended and students weren't passing their classes with those kind of accommodations.
Do you find in non-professional jobs where you mention your mental health more important or less important for disclosure? I think the question is asking if disclosure is more or less important based on whether you have a professional or non-professional job.
Yeah, I will just share my opinion because I don't have hard data on this, but I would imagine that it's easier to disclose if you're in a professional job, simply because that position comes with greater job security and higher status and probably higher pay, and a lot of those things that in that experiment I mentioned, we are guessing that people are going to be less prejudiced towards the lawyer than the data entry clerk, because we do know that in society, people tend to look up to people in higher status positions. So I would guess that it might be met with less support for a person in a lower status position overall, but I'm not speaking to any particular job set. Just that's a sociological sort of trend, I suspect is true.
Thank you. So there are a couple, one question kind of goes back to the personality attributes. It's really trying to focus on, if you've done any work around considering, or even if that's an area that you have been interested in the past around personality versus profession.
I haven't zeroed in on that per se, but I am writing this book based on a whole nother set of interviews that I'm still recruiting for, by the way, if anyone wants to volunteer. If you meet the condition, it's anybody who's ever been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and that is it. So I'm interviewing people diagnosed with borderline personality and learning a lot about their experiences, but it's not focused on this question that you're posing. But I would say that I have always believed that personality can't change. And I don't think personality disorder is a lifelong condition necessarily. I think that's one of the reasons I have qualms with the psychiatric diagnostic system, because sometimes it implies if you have a personality disorder, that's how you will be your entire life. But research shows that borderline personality disorder, for example, if you even accept it exists, which some people don't, people do completely recover, especially with intensive treatment. And just in general, personality can change if you move into different settings. Socialization has a lot to do with personality development and change.
And I think this follow-up question is a little bit about that in your perspective around diagnosis, right? That there is a lot of conversation about how diagnosing can be by identifying people by their diagnosis, and you've spoken about this before, can be overly simplistic and doesn't actually demonstrate the spectra of the disability or ability. And so I think that's just, it sounds like that's something that you are continuing to try to figure out different ways to reach out to different people.
Oh yeah. In that study, I learned a lot because here I was a skeptic about diagnoses I've been given in my lifetime, and I've been given a lot of different ones. I can tell you that. It's like hard to, I couldn't even count. So to the point where this really doesn't make any sense. But many of the professional people I talked to were very comfortable with their diagnoses and accepted them. So I was particularly fascinated with all of those people with bipolar disorder who didn't really have any questions about it and were going completely by the book of what they read on online and so on. That had a really profound impact on me because I was actually looking, I think I was looking not just to do research, but to find people who I could talk to, or I could listen to anyway, who might agree with me. I did not. But this current study, you know, the invitation is ever been diagnosed with, regardless of whether you agree or disagree, or think that you have this disorder. So that's the difference in the way I'm approaching it now. And so I'm hearing from people why they don't identify with diagnoses. They might identify with just one or just the other, but not, or both, or neither.
Excellent. As a psych rehab practitioner and trainer and a licensed creative arts therapist, can you offer more thoughts on the use of storytelling in promoting better mental health and work satisfaction?
Well, I think, you know, the telling one's own story, either like publicly, like I'm prepared to do, or even under a pseudonym, can be really healing. So that's what I know the most about, is like the narrative of one's own life and getting it out there. So some of the people I interview say, please use my real name. I'd have no shame about this. I want it to get out there. Most people are comforted by the fact that I use pseudonyms, and I just have to be consistent with everyone. So I think telling one's story anonymously, or coming to a place in life where it's safe to tell it publicly, is very healing. And that was what my one storyteller said. But just writing stories in general, if you're writing fiction, I think be really beneficial. Storytelling, painting, music making, all of those creative arts have been very therapeutic for me.
Thank you. There's also, so this is a response to that, around this conversation around storytelling. And there's an opinion that there is also the opinion that to keep telling one story may be reliving trauma again and again. So, you know, I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, I do think that one needs to think about that and maybe be coached to consider that possibility and be cognizant of it. How you tell your story in a way that doesn't traumatize you or re-traumatize you. There's certain issues that are really difficult to talk about, like being a victim of sexual violence, which I am, and it's really difficult to talk about. And so even to write about, I mean, even just bringing it up right now, I'm all agitated, you know, and I'm not experiencing trauma, but I'm remembering it, and it's really hard to speak about. So I think things like that are severely traumatizing and really hard to work out, you know, maybe you want to just touch lightly on, like I'm doing.
Well, I think we are out of time for today, but I do want to thank you so much for sharing your research and sharing your thoughts. I think we had kind of a very broad-ranging discussion at the end here. I also want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to participate. Please take a minute and fill out the survey about this webinar. It is posted in the chat. And a video of this presentation will be posted online at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation in case you would like to access it later. And if you reach out to Dr. Elliott, she would be happy to share the slides with you. And finally, we are in the process of scheduling another webinar for the beginning of May, so pay attention to your email. And so thank you all, and take care. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.